Well, this lecture is not, as somebody suggested to me, about David Goodbourn. But I'm really grateful to be allowed to come and give the lecture because I wanted to pay some kind of public tribute to all that I owe to him. I don't think I need to repeat his great gifts and characteristics, but he was an extremely intelligent person, very reliable, a wonderful colleague. I've happily worked with hundreds of people by now. I think there's a very few that I can honestly say I could not have done without, and David was certainly one of them. His main qualification for getting on with me was that he had a sense of fun. There won't be much of that around tonight, but... And we sometimes thought, of course, behind closed doors, that we probably laughed more than we did theology. And my only grumble about him is that he was extraordinarily tenacious in discussion. He would argue about anything. And what really got to me was that at the end of the argument, I usually had to admit that he had won. I'd given the title of this lecture before I kind of realized that David and I have spent, I think, almost all our, as it were, paid working life working for charities of one kind or another. So at least the title of the lecture is a bit appropriate. And for those of you who don't know, in celebration of this lecture, they have just opened a revival of the musical Sweet Charity in London. And if you want to know where you are when you are, and I'm sorry it's a written text, but I wanted to be careful about what I said. And it's about 45 to 50 minutes. So, Sweet Charity. Over the past few years, I have been drawn into charitable work on restorative justice. Restorative justice is not easy to define, and the term can be used in multiple ways. But at its most focused, as you probably know, it offers an alternative to the criminal justice system and the courts. It brings together offenders and victims with a facilitator round a conference table and offers the offender the opportunity to express remorse and victims the chance to tell their stories and make clear the often traumatic effects of the harm that has been done. It offers both offender and victim a chance to understand each other better and discuss what might be done to heal the situation rather than hurt even more and make things worse. At its best, the outcome can be two restored lives. One regaining a sense of moral worth and self-respect, and the other able to move on. And in my limited experience, there is often a moment when the tension between the two is relaxed and something that might be called forgiveness occurs. Restorative justice has produced a mound of literature and is surrounded by a great deal of discussion, not to say controversy. Early on, I became concerned about an issue strikingly similar to one I encountered when involved in international development with Christian aid. In that setting, it was attached to the word rehabilitation. In an emergency, when people lost their homes and livelihoods and found themselves displaced, for example in refugee camps, there was no getting round the urgent need to rehabilitate them. They needed enough security to go home and seeds and tools to start growing their crops again. The problem was, however, that if nothing more was done and conflict, poverty, and disease continued, they would be rehabilitated into the same social and political context that had fostered the emergency in the first place and was very likely to do so again. In the setting of restorative justice, the issue was attached not to the word rehabilitation, but to the word restoration. It readily conjures up pictures of getting things back to how they were, like restoring Notre Dame. Or rather comically, I always think, according to the Book of Common Prayer, restoring them that are penitent, only to have to plead for it again next Sunday. In the case of restorative justice, two lives may have been in some sense restored as they regained their dignity, a sense of justice and peace of mind. But as in international development, they were in danger of being restored into communities and social structures marred by inequality and deprivation that would go on being the seedbed for crime. For me and others, it raised concerns about the relationship, if any, between restorative justice and social justice, and the point at which sweet charity risks turning very sour. Let me be more specific. In the United Kingdom, there are hundreds of charities. By law, they must serve a charitable purpose, which can mean anything from the relief of poverty, the advancement of education and religion, to animal welfare, and very surprisingly, the efficiency of the armed forces. They must be independent, they must act for the public good. I believe they include in their number all the signed-up members of the Centre for Theology and Justice here, together with the Centre for Restorative Justice in Oxford. Recently, charities have been exposed to a number of criticisms, as I'm sure you know, relating, for example, to bad governance, high salaries for CEOs, the loss of the voluntary ethos, over-dependence on government funding, the power of the white middle class, and sexual misconduct. The calamity that recently engulfed Oxfam is perhaps the most high-profile of recent cases. And I should add there that had I been sitting in the CEO's chair at Christian Aid, I don't think I would have acted all that differently from the CEO of Oxfam. Just as serious is the claim that some charities do not contribute to the public good, but actually do harm. Among them, to take three examples, would be public schools, recently described as engines of privilege, perpetuating elitism and social division, international capitalists and their undemocratic philanthropic foundations dictating their own terms, and divisive religious institutions, including faith schools. Whilst recognising their force, none of these criticisms are of direct concern to me here. My specific concern is not even the familiar Marxist-style one that charity, like religion, can be the opiate of the people, skillfully dulling the pain and putting us to sleep when we should be wide awake and clamouring for radical change. Despite the criticisms, I have nothing but admiration for the work of the vast majority of charities. I have been mixed up with a good many, and for the time being chair too. Generally, I'm glad they do what they do. My concern is the extent to which they contribute and have the capacity to contribute to structural change, where the social structures aggravate the very problems they try to resolve. They may relieve, they may restore, they even may rehabilitate, but do they redeem and do they make new? By way of illustration, let me comment on the work of two charities, in addition to those dealing with restorative justice and international development. Both call themselves CAP. I confess to be somewhat prejudiced against Christians Against Poverty, because of the way its charismatic faith colours so much of its work and relationships, to the extent that you wonder whether there is a hidden agenda. A recent television documentary did nothing to allay my fears. It may actually be a bad example of connecting faith and action. I admire, however, the compassion and expertise it extends to hundreds of desperate people, which enable them to get the burden of debt off their backs, but it remains very much open to question whether it makes any significant difference to the social and economic realities that give rise to those debts in the first place and could land those people in debt again. Individual problems may be fixed, but the system remains broken. Church action on poverty takes a far more welcome approach in relation to how it handles its faith, how it works with people, and how it looks for more radical change, signalled by its determination to end hunger in this country and loosen the grip of poverty. Supposing you do so, however, by fixing the benefit system, for example, or so-called universal credit, CAP will be well aware that you still leave questions about adequate economic and social reform hanging in the air. A benefit system, however fair and necessary as a safety net, can come to look like a slice of statutory charity, if you like, where government is now the charity, restoring and rehabilitating desperate people, but into a structural reality fully capable of perpetuating the causes of their desperation. Put differently, and I quote, "The welfare system is an acknowledgement and an indictment of the inadequacies of the market system, which it does nothing to reform." The Christian churches in this country have been in the front line of social reform just as they have been bastions against it. Today there are many highly committed change makers within its ranks. Rank and file Christians and church leaders have often done their bit inside and outside the charitable sector. Nevertheless, is it fair to say that especially at the local level, the churches are often more at ease and better equipped to deal with needy individuals, whilst steering well clear of the charge levelled at bishops and archbishops when they speak out, that they should keep clear of politics and get on with their jobs? There is an interesting illustration of how compassionate deeds can fall short of the radical and social change they require in discussions about human rights and the charitable and non-charitable organisations that work for them. Human rights can be declared universally under the auspices of the United Nations, whilst the circumstances within which human rights workers struggle to uphold them remain completely unchanged. Or again, they can to some extent actually be upheld whilst those circumstances get worse. Contrast two realities that existed side by side during the 1970s, when for a time discussion about a new international economic order came much to prominence. On the one hand, basic provision against destitution and a greater measure of human dignity were being achieved as a universal human right. On the other hand, and at the same time, economic and social inequalities were widening, and all too soon the debate about a new economic order was pushed to one side. Neoliberalism and market fundamentalism have changed the world, whilst the human rights movement has posed no threat to it whatsoever. It is a scenario which sits well with the familiar observation that human rights, as we understand them, are informed by individualism and too little by communitarianism. We protect the individual, but fail to ensure the collective welfare. My concern so far is the capacity of charities to contribute to social justice with the implied criticism that all too often they don't. The criticism may not, however, be fair. The word capacity, for one thing, should be taken seriously. Charities and those involved in them may be willing but lack the capacity to go deeper and further. They can't do everything, and by overstretching themselves, they may jeopardize the one thing they can do really well. They also act under the constraints imposed by government and the Charity Commission, which sometimes make it very difficult to navigate between what is and is not regarded as acceptable political activity. Questions have been raised recently, for example, about their freedom to campaign and spend money, and the amount of money they can spend on campaigning activities, not least during an election. Some of those charities may have to look over their shoulders at their supporters, whether individuals, trusts or governments. Nevertheless, and again to be fair, it is not hard to find development charities, for example, which are not content with rehabilitation and at least speak the rhetoric of structural change. I take an example, not Christian Aid. Health Poverty Action, a small charity with which I was once involved, has this to say in its most recent annual review: we cannot improve healthcare without dismantling the unjust policies that damage it in the first place. That's why we combine our healthcare work with global campaigns and advocacy that ensure that we tackle the root causes of poverty and poor health. That is admirably spoken, but I think the rhetoric remains untested. There are other grounds for being cautious when criticising charities for failing to bring about structural change. Structural and social change, as against rehabilitation, is not the surefire solution to problems it is sometimes made out to be, as if all the difficulties lie with those who shy away from it and not with those who embrace it. Similar to the ecosystems which we are urged these days to understand better, the social context is a highly complex system of its own, and intervening with the best of intentions can lead to unexpected consequences which can indeed make matters worse or not much better. The Arab Spring, of course, is a shocking historic example. South Africa is not far behind, along with Chavez's Venezuela. On the home front, the move to radically alter the benefit system was in some quarters a genuine attempt at social reform. Unforeseen, however, were the food banks sought out by people not out of work but in employment. And years ago, Margaret Thatcher's sale of council houses, as they were then called, designed to create a healthy, poverty-owning society, as well, of course, as loyal Tory voters, contributed to a general housing shortage, a lack of social and affordable housing, and rising cases of homelessness on our streets. Fair Trade Fortnight is observed every year in February and March, organised by the Fair Trade Foundation, yet another charity. It aims to ensure that government, producers and retailers commit to policies which ensure that farmers receive a living income, which enables them to live simply, but pay for essentials such as clothing, medicines and school fees. Whilst the aims have won wide support, questions have also been raised about the possible negative effects on the market and on farmers who are not immediate beneficiaries. Overall, what is required is not fairer wages for some, but fairer rules and practices of world trade as a whole. And talking of consequences, there is one consequence that should not be unforeseen because it is entirely predictable. And that is the knee-jerk reaction of powerful vested interests, which any attempt at radical social reform will produce and will certainly have to contend with. My specific criticism of the apparent failure of restorative justice to contribute to social justice may also be unfair. To begin with, many of its advocates are as acutely aware of this point as I am and share the same concern. But going beyond that, its contributions may be described as incremental or indirect, and none the worse for that. If, for example, restorative justice reduces the rate of reoffending, keeps people out of prison, restores to the community not offenders but responsible citizens, then it is contributing to social capital, and with increased social capital comes change for the better. The attempt to establish restorative cities also carries potential. Restorative justice is usually narrowly associated with encounters between offenders and victims as an alternative to criminal court proceedings. But restorative principles and practices, which means going about things in a restorative rather than a punitive way, can be adopted far more widely. and can be embedded in every sector of a city's life, from schools to the workplace to healthcare to local government departments, so that in the end, and step by step, a city could be transformed. The change could be regarded as a Gramsci-style alternative to revolution, where the hegemony of one culture or one way of life gradually gives way to a better one. These incremental aspects of restorative justice, transforming the context and not only restoring the individual, do exist, though it has to be said that a great deal more research is needed into the claims made for them, such as reducing reoffending. And along with restorative justice itself, they remain fairly fragile and vulnerable to changes in personnel, political policies and funding. A restorative culture can unfortunately be here today and gone tomorrow. To draw this part of the discussion together, I remain concerned when too much charitable activity is about restoration and rehabilitation rather than radical social reform, dealing with symptoms rather than causes. More overt efforts at social reform, however, are not without their own problems, and the more indirect and incremental contributions of charities to reform should not be downplayed. 4 requirements, however, can fairly be made of charities. First, charities must show themselves well aware of the need for social change which goes far beyond what they are capable of bringing about. Their perspective must be long and not myopic. Their mood must be one of discontent with the not enough. Second, a charity must make sure of one thing that is well within its capabilities, and that is that it does nothing knowingly to make matters worse, maintaining the deepening, for example, social inequalities. And here a number of charities, in my judgment, should remain within our critical sights. Third, charities exist for the public benefit, or what I would call the common good, whilst accepting that they cannot do everything, must ensure that what they can do is in line with wider strategies for social reform. And incidentally here, recent criticism of so-called celebrity white saviours should probably be upheld insofar as they perpetuate dependency and disregard for the abilities of those they claim to help, a thoroughly unstrategic approach. And fourth, charities must help to build and be part of networks and alliances and social movements which can significantly increase their potential. In my limited experience, the Southern Africa Alliance in the days of apartheid, the Jubilee Debt campaign leading up to the millennium, were good, though not perfect, examples. Extinction Rebellion, let us hope, might well become another. It might have struck you by now as odd that in the setting of Luther King House and a Centre for Theology and Justice, committed to connecting faith and action, I have talked a lot about justice but scarcely said anything about faith or theology. So where and how does this, for us Christian faith, I take it, connect with my concern? If Christianity, the faith in question, is what we believe or say we believe in response to the gospel stories, then my Christianity at least shares my concern. According to the Gospels, this faith goes in for charitable acts of kindness and compassion, such as helping a penniless wayfarer or a debtor, or the mentally or physically ill, or a sick or ostracized woman or man. But it also goes in for social justice when, for example, the rich are challenged to redistribute their wealth. Even more fundamentally, it engages in revolutionary talk and action which not only threatens the authorities, whether Jewish or Roman, but promises to turn the economic, social and political order upside down and so change everything, if only it could. It resonates both with the individualism of the Western world and the drumbeats of liberation theology. It is not content to restore or save individuals. Despite the enormous odds against it, it is out to refashion the social order in the shape of what it calls the kingdom of God. It restores, it redeems, it reimagines, and it recreates. It is out to make all things new. But when we get to the front line of this kingdom building, to reshape the actual social order, where ultimately Christians are called to go, and when it comes to informing and implementing policies, theology is not the discipline required. Having accepted the claims of justice and the need to change the socio-economic order to benefit the many and not the few, and make the political order here and round the globe more equitable and inclusive, once we get there and ask, well, what actually needs to be done and how, then Christianity, apart from some important broad brushstrokes or criteria, has very little to say. The broad brushstrokes include those of Christian realism. They remind us not to expect too much or too little of human beings, who can stubbornly cling to their self-interest but also rise generously to an occasion. In other words, don't go designing a utopian future which does not take our strengths and fallibilities into account. In addition, there are the broad claims, obviously, of justice, respect, human flourishing, inclusiveness, claims that at times Christianity, far from upholding, has had to learn. Others, including a Christian Aid report, have mentioned creativity, generosity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, all hallmarks of a good economic system. After that, after those generalities, faith does not have either the knowledge or the skills required to fashion it. Christianity, with its theology and faith, does not, for example, have the recipe for marrying full employment with meaningful work and decent wages. It does not know how to keep a healthy competition alive in a cooperative society. It has no recipe for social mobility. It does not know how to distribute wealth or power or create a tax system whereby we look after one another and universal credit finally becomes redundant. It has no idea about how to harness artificial intelligence for the common good. It cannot roll out an adequate housing program or access to equal educational opportunities for all, or devise a holistic joined-up health service. It has no insights into how to counteract the growing surveillance economy as it commodifies the data it surreptitiously gathers about our own personal lives. It cannot design a new international order, any more than devise a 10-point plan for a fair economy, such as that put forward in 2018 by the Commission on Economic Justice. It cannot resolve the age-old forever debate which surrounds capitalism about the size of the state as against the private sector and the control and freedom of the market. It does not know how to save the planet, or reduce emissions, or feed a growing population in a sustainable way. And so we could go on. Of course, we can object that if Christianity does not know how, neither apparently does anybody else. No one on earth knows the complete answer or is sufficiently competent to find it. Nevertheless, what limited competence or capability is available to us as human beings does not lie in the Christian or any other faith, though agreed Islam may well push that point further. It lies in what might be called secular disciplines, or what I am going to call the technologies of justice, such as economics, politics, sociology, the behavioural sciences, management, diplomacy, and of course scientific research and invention. Christian faith can but grant or withhold its imprimatur in the light of those broad principles we have discussed, but after the event. Even if Christian faith had the competence to engage on this front line, it could not do so in the language of faith. Every attempt at radical reform, whether of the social justice system or advocating a restorative approach, or of the economic and social order as a whole, can only come about by way of cooperation between many disciplines and people of many faiths, religious or otherwise. The discourse and any agreements which follow belong to the public space, compatible with, maybe, but not identified with any single faith. A colleague of mine, for example, writes persuasively about restorative justice from the standpoint of his Catholic Christian tradition. But his arguments completely lose their force once his assumptions are not shared. The language and the reasoning have to be secular here, not sacral. On both these counts, first, that on the front line of structural change, faith does not have the competence to contribute. And second, that in any case, the discourse has to be secular. We are left with what might be called religionist Christianity, not quite in the sense that Bonhoeffer had in mind, though with exactly the same awareness and acceptance of what we cannot have and do not have. We've been discussing charity in relation to justice, and when it comes to Christian charities, including churches, the primary importance of what might be called the kingdom frontier, where Christians engage with others in fashioning a new social order, at which point we have recognized what, for me, is the very real disconnect between theology and justice, between faith and action. When we get to the frontier and begin to ask how justice can be implemented, Christianity has nothing to say. This conclusion, in turn, prompts a further question, especially in the context of a centre aspiring to connect faith and action. Namely, if I have highlighted a disconnect, then what are the valid connections? And I want to look at 5. They have to do first with integrity, second with those basic Christian principles I've referred to, thirdly with equipping and training the saints, fourthly about support, and fifthly the reasons for doing what we do. The first connection between faith and action, as I see it, is one of intellectual and moral integrity. It has 2 concerns. First, to make sure that we do not say one thing as people of faith about the priority of the poor or the claims of justice, for example, and do another. Or that we do not go along with a social order that is incompatible with what we say we believe, at which point prophecy and protest must have their day. Equally, on the intellectual level, we do not allow a faith or theology which claims to make sense of our human experience to be so at odds with that experience, such as clinging to rainbow dreams and insisting that all will be well, whilst all appears to be heading for global disaster, or strangely rejoicing in God's final victory over sin and death and evil, while mourning over 200 lives taken on Easter Day in Sri Lanka. Does it add up? The second connection after this, integrity, takes us back to that middle ground between faith and action already discussed. It has to do with broad principles, such as the justice, dignity, generosity, realism, and inclusiveness which ought to characterize any social order. We should note, however, that whilst these broad brush strokes may be compatible with Christian faith, and as we see things now required by Christian faith, they are not always distinctively Christian or derived from the Christian tradition. They are recognized and upheld by others irrespective of any religious commitment. Christianity has often adopted them and been influenced by them, rather than pioneered or inspired them in prophetic mode. At times it has actually stood for something akin to their opposites. For example, when it comes to justice, it has been far more punitive than restorative. and when it comes to gender and sexuality, far from inclusive. Faith has had to learn as well as inspire. And one real advantage of the religionless nature of these principles is that it enables people of faith to find common ground with others, which is so essential for social reform. A third connection between faith and action has to do with equipping the saints, the obvious territory of these training institutions here. I have suggested that charities must at least place themselves strategically among the people and movements working for the kind of changes that could eventually put most of them out of business. I include in that charities like restorative justice and development NGOs such as Christian Aid. When it comes to Christian faith, I have suggested that it has little of substance to contribute to frontline workers or the designers of the kingdom as they struggle to reorder our world for the better. At that point, ours is a religionless Christianity. But where Christianity and faith talk will be absent, as it were, Christian women and men will or should most certainly be present, since according to my understanding, this is the most important place to which they are inspired by the gospel stories to go beyond charity, to where a just and humane social order is designed and built, all of which raises a question about equipping the saints, to which I do not pretend to know the answer, even though I am acutely interested in finding it. So what is on offer? At present, in centres like this one at Luther King House and in local churches, we provide training for ministry and discipleship within the church and beyond, in chaplaincies and the workplace, for example, whether lay or ordained. We also provide theological and Christian education ranging from baptismal and confirmation classes to Lent courses, study groups, and academic degrees. At best, all of these will be contextual in character based on action reflection models, allowing faith and experience to uncomfortably interact. But what of that front line I have been discussing, or the coalface? Two equally unfortunate metaphors in a world where war and fossil fuels should be no more. So what of the frontier, where the kingdom is actually designed and implemented, where it is not a matter of connecting faith and action, but of disconnect between the two, because the relevant disciplines are not so much faith and theology, but disciplines like economics, politics, sociology, diplomacy, science, to name but a few. I suspect we should not make any further effort to equip what might be called the professional kingdom builders, who have been through their education and training and apprenticeships and should know what they are doing. The church should probably get off their backs, as it were, whilst honouring and supporting their work as a crucial part of Christian mission. But what of the rank and file to which most of us here belong? In a Centre for Interfaith Community Relations in Leicester, of which I am a member, there is much talk about religious literacy. It is not concerned with interfaith dialogue as such, but with working with diverse communities and peoples of different religious faiths as they learn how to live well together. Training in religious literacy is offered and accepted by church congregations, but also by several other sectors of the community, including teachers, nurses, the police, and the army, amongst whom, of course, Christians are also found. The aim is to create in them a better understanding of the diverse social realities, including highly coloured religious realities, within which they live and work, so that they are better equipped to navigate them and contribute to their well-being. The comparison is certainly not exact, but when we come to the task of designing and constructing a reformed social order, which no longer aggravates the problems which charity tries to address, and where theology and faith have little of substance to contribute, should those who set out to equip the saints try to promote a greater degree of religious literacy or theological literacy, not religious literacy or theological literacy, but of economic and political and sociological literacy. It could be important and constructive for a number of reasons, some of which mirror the arguments in favour of religious literacy. It could, for example, increase our understanding and our ability to navigate the increasingly fraught political and economic terrain and make us ordinary, extraordinary people a useful contribution. It could also help to overcome the fears and hesitations of many about getting involved in politics and matters which, as they say, they do not understand and are now more tempted to write off. Of even more importance, however, is the recognition that if theology cannot be left to the theologians, politics and economics cannot be left to the professionals. Theirs are not exact sciences. Like the theologians, they disagree amongst themselves, they get things wrong, and the best of them know that they rarely get things entirely right. They are human beings. They have their foibles and their vested interests like the rest of us. For health's sake, they need to be part of a participatory and democratic community. They need well-informed, critical companions along their way. Agreed, it may be very difficult to equip the saints in this way. They too may see it as yet another obligation on top of all the other demands that are made of them, not least by churches and charities. Of more significance, the saints may not feel any urgent need for it, in very stark contrast to the way people feel an urgent need for religious literacy in communities where ethnic and religious minorities begin to add up to the majority, and people feel threatened, and sparks fly and are fanned into flames. Or again, in contrast to the immediacy of poverty and injustice, which drove people into the base Christian communities of Latin America to be taught what? To teach themselves politics. That, of course, may change as the rapidly increasing impact of global warming comes closer and closer to home and throws up more and more urgent questions about the economic order, migration, increasing conflict, and about our national and international political institutions. Last but not least, the saints may well feel that what the professionals most need to rub up against are experts of an entirely different kind, rather than amateurs in their own field. An obvious example would be the expertise of those who have experienced the poverty and vulnerability that the professionals set out to eradicate. I well remember sitting on one occasion in a consultation between poor farmers in Ethiopia and the visiting World Bank and IMF economists, who dismissed the evidence the farmers presented in support of changes in policy as merely anecdotal, when those so-called anecdotes were exactly the expert evidence that they needed to hear. Church Action on Poverty's hearings underline a similar point. None of these hesitations, however, should be allowed to obscure what to me is a clear sense of priorities when it comes to preparing for Christian discipleship and kingdom building. Understanding our faith and the visions and moral parameters it offers is, of course, important. Speaking truth to power and being prophetic about what will and will not do in the light of those visions and parameters is equally, if not more, important. But none of that is enough, as the theology of justice must give way to the technology of justice, where in days when we're told the institutions of governance are falling apart, we need to ask and to teach one another at the cutting edge of our discipleship about how to be political, how to order this polis, this earthly city, in ways that are acceptable and effective, not to restore but to fashion a just social order. A fourth connection between faith and action, in addition to integrity, those broad principles and equipping the saints, might be called supportive. If Christian faith, though not of course Christians, is silent on the front line because it is not competent to speak, where is it competent to speak? apart from those broad principles already referred to. For me, its competence lies not in designing a new world, but in supporting, if that is not too bland a word, those who design it and who struggle to implement their designs. Here, well behind the lines, it breaks its silence. It finds a voice. It has something to say and begins to speak and reassure, above all, when the saints gather to observe the one distinctive thing about them, namely the weekly rituals of word and sacrament. Here are some examples of what Christian faith is competent enough to say and do in this supportive mode. All of them culled from the great creedal themes of creation, fall, redemption, forgiveness, resurrection, hope, and eschatology, all of them woven into the liturgy of the church. It can renew the spirits of those on the front line with strange and enigmatic sayings and gospel stories that crack open the old world with a sighting of something new. It can uphold a compelling moral vision not of sexual hang-ups, but of the attractiveness of love distributed as justice. It can be prophetic rather than endlessly prescriptive. When all seems negative, it can insist that there is much about the world and its peoples that is good. It can suggest that the search for justice is so lofty that it has about it the aura of transcendence. It can warn the kingdom designers that perfection cannot be had in this world, and probably not at all, and to guard themselves against disappointment and despair when what they struggle so hard to achieve fails to come their way. It can reassure them that when they fail, and however bad their failure may be, it does not rule them out of being part of a great enterprise. It can speak quietly and not triumphantly of the creative energies of costly love. And it can remind the saints that whilst nothing can be perfect, no situation is closed or devoid of possibilities for the future. It can offer companionship, sublime and mundane, along the road. Here is the competence of Christianity to connect faith and practice. It is exercised, as I said, primarily within the liturgical community. It is a human community which, with integrity, is well aware of the inevitable gap between what it has to say and what it does. It does not practice what it preaches. It cannot model the kingdom, even if it does its best to show respect and compassion. It can only offer, week in, week out, word and sacrament, stories and memories, visions and values, bread and wine, prayer and song, blessing, absolving, and signs of peace, so that kingdom workers are fed and sent on their way. It can only lift their spirits rather than endlessly add to their burdens. It can only try to support instead of constantly asking for support. A fifth and final connection, or possibly connection between faith and action, is closely related to the fourth and is a bit difficult to deal with in a short space of time. The fourth one has to do with where we find fresh energy and the renewal of our spirits. The fifth has to do more with the reasons for our commitment to the charitable activities that are only finally fulfilled in justice. The reasons lie in our faith. If we believe, for example, that we are all equally important, then we work and should work hard for a more equitable world. On a wider canvas, the Christian faith as a whole offers a story, or what in discussions today are called meta-narratives. It offers a story or a meta-narrative about what life is all about, within which our endeavours to create a new world make sense intellectually as well as emotionally. It provides what Rowan Williams called the wellspring of our commitment, the root from which it grows. An archetypal story, for example, of a good world marred by sin and disobedience, rescued by a saviour, set on a path towards a new creation, provides an account of the reality within which we live, which makes sense of our lives and of our endeavours to right wrongs, not only to love worthily, but to do justly. The story answers the question, well, why behave like that? Well, why behave like that? Because we believe ourselves to be part of a greater story where the energies of love press on against all odds to create a new heaven and a new earth, and we are invited to be partners in that endeavour. Such a story told by faith frames and makes sense of our actions for justice. Faith and action here are extremely closely connected. And incidentally, you can see just how close and potent that connection can become when you look at the Islamist extremists of today. This sort of reasoning where faith fails, this sort of reasoning raises many questions. I cannot pursue them here, but the most obvious implication is that where we no longer believe and where faith and that wellspring dries up, then our sense of moral purpose will dry up with it. And there are genuine anxieties that in an increasingly secular or religionless society, that may well prove to be true. But without dismissing them, we must be honest enough to recognize just how many people are committed to struggling for justice and who have very good reasons for doing so, whilst they do not have any conscious connection to a religious faith. I am not now thinking of the Dawkins of this world, that is another debate. I am simply recognizing the impressive numbers of those who struggle for justice without connecting it at all to any religious faith. It prompts the question, the uncomfortable question for me, as to what exactly are we doing when we set out to make connections between faith and action. We may be encouraging the church and its people to go beyond charity with the support of their faith and join everybody else on the front line of radical social change. And of course, very well and good. However, we may also be trying yet again to carve out a place for the faith and its institutions at a time when they are in danger of being squeezed out, so that yet again what we like to think of as mission is in reality maintenance, that our motivations may not be entirely beyond question. In those endeavours, we may all be restorers after all. To finish, the biases of this lecture, I hope, will be obvious by now. First, towards reforming and remaking the social structures far and near that perpetuate the pain and sorrow in which charities like Restorative Justice, Christian Aid, and Church Action on Poverty try to respond. Second, towards reaffirming that the work of designing and building those new orders is what we mean by building the kingdom on earth. And I am no longer at all sure there is anywhere else to build it. Third, a bias towards the relevance of secular disciplines such as economics, politics, and sociology rather than theology, when actually designing and constructing the kingdom. And fourth, towards looking carefully and critically at the ways in which we connect faith and action, and how we might equip and support the saints on the front line even better than we do. And I suppose there is another bias in favour of the so-called laity. As I really draw to a close, a friendly, though at times not so friendly, ghost from the past, known to some of you here, looms into view. During the 70s and early 80s, the colleges here were closely involved in the lay movement of the day. which sadly rapidly faded as questions of survival and church maintenance pushed it aside. It was led by such luminaries as Sir John Lawrence, who founded the journal Frontier. Yes, Frontier, a word which resonates exactly with the frontline coal faces and frontiers of the kingdom referred to in this lecture. But another prominent figure in the movement was Mark Gibbs. He was a frequent visitor to Brighton Grove. His extensive library on the laity and its archives and the Audenshaw papers are housed in the University Library. Mark was co-author with Ralph Morton, whose son was for a time the MP for Moss Side, of the best-known study book at the time called God's Frozen People, which encouraged the churches to unfreeze, support and release them for precisely the secular tasks and professions that we have been discussing as keys to the kingdom. Finally, talking of friendly ghosts, or maybe better, of an absent friend, I am reminded that David Goodbourn was, of course, a layman in what were, when he arrived here and in Whalley Range, almost exclusively ministerial training camps. He knew well the nourishing role the liturgical community needs to play, and in his preaching contributed to it memorably. But he also laid the ground for what we called at the time the Christian Institute in the days before Luther King House, to support and equip the laity in their secular callings. And when it came to teaching, he did not teach theology. He taught sociology, one of the technologies of justice. I wanted to come and give this lecture in his honour. I hope he might have regarded it, including its biases, as a fitting tribute, even though he would certainly have argued almost over every blessed point I have made. Thank you.